Welcome everybody to the Becky's Anonymous live stream. This month for International Women's Day, we are discussing the intersection of femicide and white supremacy. We have two great guests with us today, Dani and Jeneile, who will be helping us walk through the historical and current context of this intersection and help us reflect, particularly for us white women in Becky's Anonymous, about how we can step into the international solidarity movement to protect women and girls and end femicide. So thank you, Dani and Jeneile, for being with us, and you'll hear more about their introductions and what brings them to this conversation as we hear from them later. But we want to open up with a video to share from Nikki Shawana, the Sister Round Dance song. And part of us sharing this is to make sure we bring into this space that all of the data and facts and discussion we're going to have today, there are real voices, real faces, real stories, real names behind everything that we're going to be discussing today. And so we want to bring those people into this space and especially today reflect on how we honor those stories. I do want to invite people to take care of yourself in this discussion. Of course, talking about femicide and white supremacy, we will be referencing extreme forms of violence. And so it's important that as we go through this discussion that we do what we need to do to take care of ourselves as we talk about this. And so now I'm going to share our opening, and then I will be introducing Jeneile, and then we'll hear from Dani.
Sister, I want you to know you are so strong and beautiful. I gotta know, where did you go? I think of you every day since you gone away. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, 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 oh, oh, how, hey, oh, hey, 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 oh, how, hey, oh, hey, 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 yo. Hey, yo, how yo, Sister, I want you to know you are so strong and beautiful. I gotta know, where did you go? I think of you every day since you gone away. Hey yo, hey yo, hey yo.
I want to just acknowledge that a lot of the video was obviously centered on what's going on in Canada, but I'm sure, as we'll hear, and I'm sure a lot of those of us in the audience recognize that a lot of those headlines obviously apply to the US context as well. I'm really excited to invite now into the space Dr. Jeneile Luebke, who is with us to help us understand a little bit about more of the historical and current context of some of these issues here in the US. Jeneile Luebke is a PhD in RN who is a postdoctoral nurse research fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Nursing. She's an enrolled member of Bad River Band. Her area of research and expertise include intimate partner violence in the lives of American Indian women and utilization and application of post-colonial and Indigenous feminist frameworks. And so I hand it over to you, Dr. Luebke, and then later we'll hear from you, Dani. So thank you and welcome.
Hi, thank you. So Buju Kiriweya Ogimakwe Nindijnakas Ajijak Nedudam Nadaao Mashki Zibing Nindujaba. So hello, my name is Dr. Jeneile Luebke, and I, as mentioned in the introduction, I am a nurse researcher for UW-Madison School of Nursing, specifically in the STREAM program, which is a program meant to recruit and retain American Indian students into the nursing program. So today is International Women's Day, and so this live broadcast is really meant to recognize that and honor all of our incredibly warrior strong sisters out there, and to also raise awareness and maybe have a little bit of a difficult discussion in something that's happening now, the topic of femicide and gender-based violence. It's something that occurs in epidemic proportions, and I think just even having discussions like this tonight and continuing to raise awareness at the alarming rates of gender-based violence is definitely a step in the right direction. So I'll share a little bit about the research that I do and how, as a nurse researcher and a survivor of violence myself, what steps am I taking to address this issue, and hopefully what I can contribute to solutions and reducing this violence and saving lives. My doctoral dissertation centered around trying to get a better understanding of the individual lived experiences with intimate partner violence among American Indian women, specifically American Indian women who live in large urban areas in Wisconsin. And although I was very knowledgeable about, the statistics, which are pretty dire, but prior to conducting this research, I was well aware of what was going on. But being in the field and seeing people face to face and hearing their stories and listening to the things that I had read about, it was very life-changing for me. It just really solidified, the statistics, and really kind of also gave me more energy and motivation to continue on this path and figure out what I could do from a nursing perspective to addressing the issue. So regarding the interviews that I did and just speaking about Indigenous women in the United States, the rates of violence are pretty high. Through a national study that was done in 2010, we know that around 85% of Indigenous women experience violence in their lifetime. That includes verbal, emotional, physical, sexual. So that's pretty staggering. And this is not something that's happening just in the United States. As we know, this is happening in Canada, Central South America, New Zealand, Australia, basically anywhere that Indigenous populations are living. And a lot of what, thinking about the root causes of this violence, it really stems from settler colonialism and the values that go along with that. So we know that violence in Indigenous communities is not traditional. It's not something that was happening prior to settler contact. Many of our communities were matrilineal. Even the ones that were patrilineal were they were very egalitarian, and there was a balance and an understanding that one sex was not more powerful or more important than the other, that it was really a symbiotic relationship in which we had our roles, through our kinship systems and our clan systems, but that our work as individuals was recognized and supported. And it wasn't until colonial contact that the systems, system of oppression like patriarchy and capitalism, things like that penetrated into our populations and manifested themselves through high rates of violence. Manifestations of settler colonialism, thinking about those root causes, the land grabs and forcing people onto reservation areas, things that really disempowered populations. It stemmed from knowing that there were valuable resources located on these lands. The lands they wanted lands for, farming and ranching, and gold, oil, all of those valuable resources. And, through the policies of oppression and, genocide, boarding schools, and also thinking about too at the earliest contacts, how Native women's bodies were sexualized and theirs for the taking, just as the land was. So, the original MMIW started, with that first settler colonial contact, when Native women were taken as sex slaves. They were raped, seen as less than, inferior, and able to be controlled. So it's really the rates of violence that we're seeing today have been perpetuated from that mindset and those values that were instilled from the very first contacts. We see a lot of this playing out in contemporary times through the land degradation and a lot of the, through eminent domain and encroaching on ceded territory with pipelines and mining and fracking and damming, things that have really caused a lot of environmental damage, but that damage is to Mother Earth. That is a part of femicide. There's a ripple effect that happens when you have all of this, this land grabbing and land degradation and violating the land for the natural resources. That ripple effect goes into Indigenous communities that are located very near these projects. And in order to do all of this work and extract all of these materials, you have to have manpower. And there is a direct correlation between the pipelines, the mining, the damming, the fracking, and violence in those communities. Some of it is through, force, like rape or kidnapping and even homicide. And some of it is also through Indigenous women being trafficked or working in sex trades. There's a lot of money with these projects, and some women who are living in impoverished areas or come from impoverished families or who were involved in the foster care system. There's many women who were taken from their families or placed into foster care, and then they are directly involved then in the sex trade, or they go missing or they end up murdered. So there's that connection there with social service, that the social services system. There's very staggering statistics about the percentage of Indigenous children that end up in foster care when there are family members who could have taken them, but they end up with non-Indigenous families. And that really perpetuates that intergenerational trauma that we see. So there's a lot of layers to this issue. There's way too much to cover in like a 15-minute conversation, but hopefully we can just kind of scratch the surface a little bit and then focus too on how non-Indigenous people may be unknowingly perpetuating oppression in these populations, and what can you do to be an ally or to help address this issue. There's other things that are still going on today too, like the Violence Against Women Act is still not passed, and that's been expired now for a few years, it's disturbing. The fact that we have task forces to deal with this issue is also disturbing to me. There are a few task forces that are doing some good work, but when the task forces are created without, the guidance and the input of Indigenous families and the survivors themselves, it can be highly problematic. So there's this this continuation of this paternalistic attitude of, that Indigenous communities don't know how to tackle these issues that impacts them, or they don't have the resources or the knowledge to take care of their own people. And nothing could be further from the truth. A lot of these things are happening without the knowledge of the people who live locally or in the states that the task forces are operating in. So I know here in Wisconsin, our MMIW task force recognizes that and has been very proactive in making sure there's representation of tribal members, tribal leaders, survivors. So that is, I think, learning through the mistakes of others. So I don't want to take too much time away from the other panelists. So I guess I'll start with that. And then as we kind of evolve through a conversation afterwards, I can go into a little bit more detail, I guess, about kind of allyship and what other allied healthcare professionals or even non-healthcare workers, like things that we could do to work together to address this issue and try to reduce the violence that's happening.
And that's exactly where we want to take this. And I think that bridges beautifully into welcoming Dani into the conversation, because we're trying to push that conversation of how do we step in allyship globally, understanding this is such an international issue, and how do we step, particularly as white women, into that space in a good and respectful way, and really appreciate we'll have some conversation after Daniela's presentation, particularly about that. So thank you so much for, as you said, this is a very short time to discuss such a huge topic, and really appreciate how wonderfully you took us through kind of all of that in such a short period of time. So I now want to welcome Dani into the space, and we'll hear from her thoughts on particularly how this issue in the rest of the world and the rest of Mother Earth, particularly south of the border, how is this historical and current context playing out in communities affected by this there. And so I will just do a quick introduction. Daniela Philipson Garcia is a white Mexican and feminist activist. While in college in Mexico City, Daniela co-founded a student-run feminist organization, Cuarta Ola, to denounce machismo, advocate to legalize abortion, and help prevent violence against women and girls. She currently lives in Brooklyn, where she works on police accountability and does yoga in her living room during the lockdown. Daniela is also a former Fulbright Garcia Scholar and has a master's in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Sometimes she publishes articles on gender, peace, and security and police reform in Mexico. And so welcome, Dani, and we're so excited to hear from you. And then Jeneile, we'll bring you back in and we'll have some discussion and last thoughts. So I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Lee, and it was a pleasure listening to Jeneile. Thank you for your presentation. And on the issue of allyship, I also just want to make clear, I consider myself to be a white Mexican. There's Mexicans of all colors. I am a white Mexican, and I'm also trying to figure out what the best way is to be the best ally I can to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, especially here in the US, which is the country that I now reside in. So for my presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about what femicide is, specifically in the context of Mexico, what is happening in Mexico, what is happening south of the border from the United States. And so I'm going to give it a brief presentation. I'm going to start by explaining what femicide is, what it means, and where the term comes from. So the term femicide, if you could please go to the next slide, Lee. The term femicide was coined in 1976 by Diana Russell, who she recently died. She recently passed away, a feminist activist and scholar. And she mentioned this term, femicide, for the first time in the International Tribunal on Crimes Against Women in Brussels to describe women who were being killed by merely men for being women. And I just realized that I am the one who has access to the presentation.
Yes.
So
Awesome. Okay. Was just about to say that. Awesome.
Here, so Diana Russell. And then 20 years later, the Mexican researcher Marcela Lagarde coined a new term, feminicidio. She used this term in a UN report and explained that in Mexico, feminicide did not just signify the murder of women, but also describes the state's active complicity by disregarding gender-based violence and the mass killing of women, its refusal to investigate or prosecute these crimes. Hence, according to Lagarde, feminicidio is a state crime. And in 2009, the Inter-American Human Rights Court found that the Mexican state was guilty of state violence and of not complying with the Belém do Pará Convention because it did not properly investigate or prosecute the femicides of 3 women, Claudia Ybet, Esmeralda, or Laura Berenice in Ciudad Juárez. As a result, there is now jurisprudence to prosecute member states of the Belém do Pará Convention for femicides. In 2014, Mexico also legally defined feminicidio and listed it as a crime. However, it really isn't clear how this measure has had any implications to prevent gender-based violence or to include or to ensure access to justice. And in my opinion, it is very important to understand feminicidio in not only as a maximum expression of violence against women, but also as a structural form of violence. It is really upheld by structural forms of violence that precede the commission of feminicidio and also continue after the act of feminicidio has been committed. And so to do this, I'm gonna give a little bit even more context of what is happening in Mexico right now. I'm gonna set the stage for Mexico's historical, economic, political, and social context. So in 1980, the Nobel laureate and author Octavio Paz, who wasn't particularly feminist, he was also a very sexist man, but he was a very good author, he was a very good writer and a sociologist, and he wrote an essay on the cultural roots of machismo. It's an interesting essay to read. I definitely have some reservations about the essay now, but it's very interesting because he wrote that the macho man, is an estranged and violent man who takes after the Spanish conquistador who colonized pre-Hispanic Mexico. And here there's already some parallels with what Jeneile was mentioning before. On the other hand, Paz describes macho culture as viewing women as either pure virgins or whores. There's no in between. According to these 2 stereotypes, women are passive and submissive, and they are not complex persons. Again, they're either saints or sinful. Latin America as a region also remains exceptionally conservative. It has the toughest bans on abortion in the world, and only a handful of countries recognize women's bodily autonomy. Latin America is almost the most economically unequal and most violent region in the world. Experts now recognize an intrinsic correlation between poverty and violence, including gender-based violence. So Mexico alone has levels of violence comparable to that of a war or a non-international armed conflict. In 2006, then President Felipe Calderón declared a war on drugs, and he deployed thousands of soldiers across national territory to fight against organized crime and against drugs when at that time they were nearly as much of a problem as they are now. Instead of eliminating drug cartels, military intervention caused more violence. It caused violence to multiply and to become ubiquitous. The military has no adequate training in human rights issues, so the situation quickly worsened by raising the tension and perpetuating human rights violations. And so right now what I'm trying to do is just to set this context in which violence in Mexico is truly generalized, and it has stemmed from the war against drugs, from also economic inequality. And just to, the next slide, I show a little bit of data, but it's really important to clarify and to emphasize that rates of homicides have skyrocketed, and also rates of forced disappearances. Also, the criminal justice system is completely overwhelmed, and only 1 of 10 homicides in Mexico get solved every year. So this is why I'm saying it doesn't matter if femicide right now is a legal term, even though it is important to recognize this form of violence that women are facing. But if it's not going to have any implications in the criminal justice system, it really right now is not worth anything. At the same time, what I mentioned, Mexico's economy has become highly dependent on the United States, and it has adopted neoliberal policies that exploit low-income workers, many of whom are women. In the early 2000s, only a decade after the North American Free Trade Agreement was signed by the US, Mexico, and Canada, the Mexican border city, Ciudad Juarez, became infamously known for the systemic and regular killings of women. Sociologists and academics have come to the conclusion that the exploitation of laborers in the border led to poor living conditions and thus to increased violence and femicide. In an amazing book about femicides, it is beautifully written, but it's very difficult to read because it is absolutely heartbreaking. It's written by an investigative journalist called Luebke Daniela, and she describes decaying, cramped buildings and ghettos that offered extremely poor and undignified living conditions for poor workers that travel into Mexico City every day to do miserable and very poorly paid jobs. Garrion clearly says that those slums where those girls were murdered were built for people to do nothing but work and die. So I'm going to go to the next slide. And here's, again, a very serious problem concerning femicide is that also there's no reliable data in Mexico. So we don't know how often femicides occur. Mexico has 32 states, and each state also uses a different legal definition to measure and to define what femicide is. So the data available is not comparable and it cannot be aggregated. What we do know is that, like the rates of homicides of men, the rates of homicides of women have increased dramatically since the beginning of the war against organized crime in Mexico in 2006. Before the war began, homicides of women mostly happened in their homes. But after the war, after 2006, the number of homicides of women in public sphere began to increase and reverse the trend of women mostly being killed at home. The data clearly tells us that the war has a differentiated impact on women, and that although it mostly affects men, it has also led to women being a danger both in their home and in the streets. So in these two graphs to the left, you can see homicide rates of men and its rates of homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. And to the right is the counterpart of this graph, but for women. So the pink is the line of men who are of rates of homicides that happen in the streets. And then the green line is the rates of homicides that are happening in homes. So to the left with men, you can see that right after 2007, it goes straight up. The rate of homicides increases significantly, and so does the same for women. And even in 2007, you can see how the tendencies in the lines, they reverse. So now homicides of women are happening more on the streets, and we can link this directly and trace it directly back to the war on drugs. And then femicides of or homicides of women that are happening in the home, they're not necessarily decreasing either. They're just remaining constant, but we really see this spike in terms of homicides of women happening in the streets. And so I'm going to go back to the book, La Fosa de Agua, which was written by Luebke Daniela, who I just mentioned. And in this book, she tells the story of 7 girls: Bianca, Jennifer, Diana Angelica, Andrea, Mariana Elizabeth, Luz del Carmen, and Luz Maria. All of these girls were brutally tortured. They were raped and they were killed by a gang in the state of Mexico. The state of Mexico is a state in the periphery of Mexico City. It is a very large state and it's also a very poor state. And this happened between 2011 and 2013. The girls ranged between the ages of 13 and 19, and many of their bodies are still missing or have not yet been found. Their killers have not been prosecuted, and their families yet await justice. And in the book, Luebke Daniela had the illustrations of the girls. So that's a picture that we see to the right. And well, exactly a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, in February in 2020, 2 femicides really shook Mexico and led to massive protests for International Women's Day. So that was exactly 1 year ago. The streets in Mexico were completely flooded with protesters, feminist protesters, all of them women who were protesting these femicides. And so Ingrid Escamilla was one of the victims in February 2020. She was a 25-year-old woman from the state of Puebla. She had a master's in tourism and business administration. Her whole life was ahead of her. And her partner, Eric Francisco Robledo Rosas, who was 46-year-old at the time of the crime, he stabbed and he killed Ingrid. After killing her, he skinned her and removed her organs. When Ingrid was found, the media shared pictures of her dismembered body, further violating Ingrid's privacy and dignity. And this is what I meant, that the violence that surrounds femicide doesn't end with the act of femicide on its own. It continues, even it goes on and continues after the victim has been killed. And this is what happened to Ingrid. The other femicide that happened last year was Fatima, who was a 7-year-old girl. Her body was found dismembered in a trash can 4 days after she went missing. And these were really the two femicides that were sort of the tipping point and that led to these massive protests. So in the left, there is a picture of the names of all the victims of femicide. And these were painted on the floor of the Zócalo, which is this massive public square downtown in Mexico City. And then in the middle, this is a picture that was actually taken yesterday. And the government decided that they didn't want to listen to the protesters and that they weren't going to even allow them to go and protest. So they put up this massive wall in front of the government building in the Zócalo. And so what feminist activists decided to do was to write the names of the victims of femicides on the wall, to turn it, instead of being a wall, to have it be a memory and a monument for the victims of femicide. And right now, as we speak, there are women protesting in the Zócalo, and they are being gassed by the police and the military. And even after they put this monument up. And to end, I know this conversation also centers around the linkages between white supremacy and femicide. So I'm going to end on this. But white supremacy directly impacts gender-based violence and femicide by perpetuating the idea there is a social hierarchy in which white people are higher up the ladder than Black, Indigenous, and people of color. This hierarchy also holds that men are superior to women and that straight and cisgender people are superior to gay, queer, non-binary, and trans people. We must dismantle these ideas. We also the ideas of capitalism, militarism, and the war on drugs are notions that are ingrained in our everyday life and uphold white supremacy, in which we must dismantle in order to live in a more equal and more empathetic society in which radical love and care prevail. It is crucial that white and American women join the struggle and the plight of Latin American feminists to highlight the struggles that they're fighting for, the issues that they're fighting for, to look beyond national frontiers and not being indifferent to what happens outside of the United States, outside of whatever your country of origin is, and look to these struggles. They have many meaningful lessons that we can learn from, and we can join in solidarity. So 2 meaningful ways of doing this is by lobbying and pressing your legislators to embrace and welcome immigrants, particularly those who are fleeing violence in Central America. Ending the war against drugs is also very important, especially in the context of Mexico and what is happening there. You can also donate to amazing non-governmental organizations in Mexico, Fondo Maria and Casa Frida, who are advocating for women's and LGBTQ persons' rights in Mexico. These are pictures from the march last year. As you can see, the streets were completely flooded. It was a very inspiring and very moving moment. And then 2 symbolic ways you can also join this movement is by reading more about gender-based violence. I'm going to share my email at the end if you want to read more about it. I'm happy to share articles and also learn about the war against drugs, because this is driving a lot of the gender-based violence that we are seeing now in Mexico. And by wearing a green handkerchief, which is the one I'm wearing now, this is a symbol of the movement for reproductive and sexual rights and health in Latin America. This symbol was first used, or the handkerchief was first used by Argentinian feminists who recently won a massive victory in favor of abortion, legalizing abortion in Buenos Aires and in Argentina. So you can make your own green handkerchief, you can wear it, or you can also reach out to me via email, and I will do my best to send you one. And with that, I'm just gonna end with these links, and thank you again, Becky Anonymous, to Lee, and to Jeneile for this amazing conversation. Oh, we can't hear you, Lee.
I was just saying, I wish we had another 7 hours, but I really appreciate it. It takes so much work to do what you both have done, which is to put so much, and it's harder, obviously, to put it in such a small time. So I really want to appreciate both of you. I do, before I open it up and want to kind of open it up to if you all had any reactions as you heard each other speak. Quickly, I just wanted to remind our Becky's Anonymous audience that you will be getting follow-up emails, and as well as in our Growth Circles, information about all of the organizations and actions that you all have shared. So just wanted to make sure to plug that you do not have to furiously write everything down, that we will be summing that up in our communication with you. So you'll be getting follow-up on that. So thank you for that piece. So now I just wanted to open up. I don't know, Dr. Luebke, if you had any. Oh, we have another guest. we've had all babies, animals, all forms of guests on here. So all are welcome. But I wanted to first just give you a moment if you had any initial kind of reactions, and then Danny, I know you also may have some things that came up that you wanted to continue to integrate. But any first reactions, Dr. Luebke, as you heard Danny speak?
I'm muted. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Just the similarities and the overlap, which is no surprise to me that there's, that this is a global issue. It also made me realize that there's so many things that I didn't talk about that I should have. But again, this would be like a semester-long course, which I actually hope to turn it into in the future. But some of the bigger issues, or one thing that I guess I failed to mention at the beginning that I usually like to when I give a presentation is that, obviously this is not a new phenomenon. This has been going on, since the earliest contact, but that Indigenous people and Indigenous women have been, fighting for this issue. It's just the media is just now starting to pay attention. But there's also this movement that's really kind of coming alive, that really builds off of the really strong foundation that survivors and families in Indigenous communities have started, over these last few hundred years. There's, especially young Indigenous women who are really turning to traditional ways and their culture to heal and to bring awareness. We've been seeing this through the ribbon skirts that Indigenous women have been wearing in the marches, and beadwork groups, and talking circles and healing circles, and just really coming together as a community. It's been really beautiful to see. So the conversation seems to focus around like doom and gloom, and but there is a piece of this that it would be wrong for me not to talk about all of the resiliency and the strength that exists in our communities, and in our survivors. So I feel like I had to mention that. And the other similarity that came to mind right away was, you talked about the lack of reliable data, and that is something that is highly problematic in the United States and in Canada too, in that we don't have one single database to track this data. And there's a number of reasons why the data is inaccurate. Some of it is misclassification as race, as Danny mentioned, I too am someone who identifies as mixed race. I'm American Indian and white. And so if something happened to me, unless I'm carrying my tribal card, I could very easily be misclassified as Caucasian, on my death certificate or whatever. There's, we have 573 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and they are sovereign nations. So they're like mini countries within our country. And, that means that there's respective jurisdictions, law enforcement, and they do not talk to each other most of the time. So, you have the FBI, you have the U.S. Marshals, you have the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and then you have, state law enforcement, city law enforcement. Some states are, some tribes work directly with the state if it's a public law state, and then some work directly with the federal authorities. And so there are so many places or so many instances in which things just fall through the cracks due to lack of communication. There's also instances of blatant racism on the part of law enforcement. Just those racist stereotypes of, a drunk Indian or them being hookers or, very derogatory and racist ideology. And so there's all these different reasons, and there's a lack of a single database. So in the federal, the Name US database, out of the cases that were reported in, I believe it was 2019, there were like 5,600 something reports of missing or murdered Indigenous women, but only 118 of those were logged into the federal missing persons database. So, that's just one small example. In Sovereign Bodies Institute, which I saw on your resource sheet, is an Indigenous-led organization that is actively working to try to close that gap and that loophole. And that was also supposed to be one of the things that the federal task force was supposed to address. And our state task forces are addressing that too. But I think just it being a very highly complex issue with respective tribes and local and federal jurisdictions, it's just very complex, and we haven't come up with a good solution to kind of have everybody sit at the same table together. So those were kind of two of the biggest things that stood out listening to Danny, was the data and the racism and some of those oppressive policies, federal policies that are not there to benefit those who, Indigenous populations were just not seen as a priority. And so our policies don't reflect that health promotion like they should. So yeah, so I don't want to ramble because I know we're short on time, but those are things that stood out to me right away.
No, that was really great. I think it connects a lot to last month's live stream was about abolition and how the answer to this is not more police. And particularly in this case, I think you're really helping hit home that not only is it not just more police is not the answer, but that survivor-led is the answer. And how do we make sure that all of this is led by survivors, and what survivors are saying is that more police is not what we need to solve these issues, that actually makes it worse and is part of the root cause of this. And I think that the data piece is such an important part of it as well, and is such a symptom or a tool in keeping this invisible and silenced. It's not a coincidence that there's not data on this. That's kind of the evidence of how we feel about this. Danny, anything else you wanted to kind of share with us, or thoughts as you were hearing that?
Yeah, some brief comments regarding data. I think I forgot to mention the organization who published that report with the graphs I shared. That organization is named Data Cívica. They're a human rights organization based in Mexico City, and they have done an amazing job of putting together the little data that is available and doing the best job possible in interpreting that data and making it available to the public. So recognizing that, and then back to what Jeneile was saying, I think the feminist movement in Mexico, at least, has drawn so much inspiration from Indigenous women, particularly the Zapatista movement, has really taught, I think, Latin American feminists a lot, and has been a very important source of inspiration based on their communitarian models. And I don't want to let this conversation end without recognizing that they have a slogan of fighting with dignity and struggling with dignity, and that is something that I often think a lot in my activism. And yeah, again, back to the conversation about resiliency, I only thought of this because I saw a poster today, or one of the cartels, the posters I saw during the protest that I was following on Twitter today. One of the it read, I don't want to be resilient anymore. I don't want to be brave anymore. I just want to be free, and I want to be safe. And I think it speaks a lot to the responsibilities being put on these marginalized, these vulnerable groups to have to defend themselves and to have to be strong, because they're always resisting, instead of just being able to be safe and be free without having to worry about their well-being. And then last but definitely not least is also this tie to environmental impact, to environmental degradation, that I think Jeneile did an excellent job of addressing and highlighting recently. The Mexican government is really embracing a very repressive stance right now. And it doesn't, and the parallels truly are amazing, because they have enforced militaristic policies. They have really reinforced those since the new government came to be 2 years ago. And recently they also passed a law which will have severe negative impact on the environment. So it's interesting to see how those policies tend to go hand in hand, and really disproportionate and detrimental effects that they have for women, for non-binary people, and LGBTQ communities. So there's definitely a lot of parallels in that as well. Also in my presentation, I highlighted the need to address structural issues which have to do with war against drugs, with militarism, with climate change, and put a stop to this violence that is perpetuated by these systems and neoliberal policies as well, capitalism. So I just want to end my presentation on that note. And again, thank you. This has been really wonderful.
Well, again, thank you both so much for, it's such a challenge putting all of this into this short time, and you all have done such an amazing job taking us through the settler colonial historical roots of this, through racialized capitalism and neoliberalism, to the war on drugs, to all of it, to connecting it to what we're doing to our Mother Earth and the planet, and how all of this is connected. And really appreciate you all sharing that, and sharing both the concrete steps, which again we'll be sharing with our network, that you can take tomorrow, but also giving us a lot to reflect on and think about. How do we do this? I really appreciated the word dignity, and how do we really hold on to that and explore what does that mean for all of us, but also really exploring. I appreciated, Danny, what you were saying about, moving from just resiliency and survival to true freedom and safety for all of us, and how we all win when that happens. So we are going to end now with our closing, which is quite a statement of resiliency and survival. This is a video that Danny will hear your words just to introduce it. This video is really focusing on the abolitionist piece, I think, of this conversation, and really focusing on particularly the police role in all of this. We were talking about data, and one of the data points that I think is super important for us to reflect on here in the US and as white women is that police are 2 to 4 times more likely to commit domestic violence than the general population. So if that's where we're looking for the solution, I don't think it's going to be there. But we also need to reflect about, again, how that's not a coincidence. That our police are more violent because that's how this system is upheld and protected, but at a tremendous cost, which we've obviously discussed here. So Danny, would love to hear any thoughts that you have and just kind of introducing our closing. I want to thank both of you so much for your time tonight and all your hard work with your presentations. To the Becky's Anonymous audience, please follow up with us at our Grow Circle this Wednesday to go deeper into what we've talked about. We'll also be communicating on our social media and through email all of the specific actions, organizations, and resources that have been shared with us today. So before we end with our closing, again, thank you both. Happy International Women's Day to you and everyone out there. And Danny, any last thoughts about this video?
Yeah, the video is a choreography and a song that was composed by a feminist collective in Chile during the protests that happened in 2019 in Chile. So yeah, it's a very powerful video. It's a choreography that's spread around the world and that many movements took up and replicated in different parts of the world. So I thought it would be nice to share.
Great. Well, thank you both and have a wonderful evening.
El patriarcado es un juez que nos juzga por nacer y nuestro castigo es la violencia que no ves. El patriarcado es un juez que nos juzga por nacer y nuestro castigo es la violencia que ya ves. Es femicidio. Impunidad para el asesino. Es la desaparición. Es la violación. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. La culpa se pagó, ni me pagan, ni loco. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. El violador es tú. Son los barcos. El Estado. El presidente.